Hi everyone, welcome back to Memories for the People. I'm George Farrar and I'm pleased to present to you today a show about Florida. Now, Florida has always been looked at, especially in the past, as some sort of exotic place. And we see in this artwork here the story of it being tropical, right? Remote, especially back in the days of steamships and railroads, and these big, huge industrialists would build these railroads and big hotels. But ultimately, when the automobile came along, people didn't have to necessarily take a steamboat or a railroad. They can take, in the early days, what was called the Dixie Highway. And people would go out and have these great adventures. So, what I'd like to do today is share with you the kinds of adventures and things that went on mostly pre-Disney, okay? So we're talking before the 1970s, though I'll talk a little bit with you about my life in the 1980s in Florida. And here we see US Highway 1, which back in from the 1950s through the 1990s, it was actually displayed as a red sign, not the black and white signs we see today, at least in Florida. And so my father and I would, and along with my stepmother and half-brother, would go up and down US Highway 1 between St. Augustine and Jacksonville, and we would see these old roadside attractions. This one is Gatorland, Alligator Farm, not to be confused with the current Alligator Farm that was also in business, but it had closed. And so when I knew of Gatorland, it was after it had closed, and so my father and my family, we were all in the car, the family station wagon a lot of times, going up and down the road. And every once in a while we would stop to look at the alligator, and we would stop at these places and look. These were places of time gone by. Sometimes people talk about tourist traps, and sometimes you would end up, as a kid, you'd end up in some diner or restaurant somewhere, and the waitress would put down a paper map of Florida showing you all the great places you could go if you would just finish up your eggs, bacon, orange juice, and milk and cereal. You could just get on the road and see what adventures awaited you. And I used to like brochures as a kid. I'd go down to St. Augustine in the 1980s from Jacksonville mostly with my family. Every once in a while, school trips, things like that. I'd get brochures, and you'd see the inevitable, and this went on way back before my time, of people being ferried around essentially on in these little tourist mobile kind of things, sometimes originally with horses and then later on with just little truck things, little trolley kinds of things. Get on the bus, get on the trolley, and go around town and see what's out there. And St. Augustine was filled with tourists in the summer. St. George Street and all the historic places in the nation's oldest city. And an incredibly vibrant time as a child, and being able to see people just coming to Florida to visit, and you're there, you live there, you're a native, right? I lived in Florida from the time I was born until I was in my 40s. Okay, so I lived in Florida a long time, saw a lot of changes. And absolutely fascinating, though, absolutely fascinating experiences. And I can even say at one point I went to the Wax Museum. This is before my time, Potter's Wax Museum, but I went on an ill-fated date with someone in the 21st century, and and didn't forget that. Nothing like going to a wax museum, so there were all these, especially in St. Augustine, all these unique places. Now, my father tried to avoid a lot of what he considered tourist traps or kinds of places for visitors to check out. I always wanted to go to the old jail, but he was never kind of big on that. There were places I went to ultimately that were places I went on school trips, and I ultimately did take the little tourist run around the city on a school trip, went to the alligator farm, things like that. But I always wanted to go to the old jail. Never made it to the old jail, which was incidentally, I believe, the old jail, literally the old jail, and it was just converted to be a tourist. Mostly, I think, where you would hop on and off one of those tourist little trolley things. But I got a kick out of it, and all these unique attractions try to get you off the road and get you into having some interesting experiences. And of course, the alligator farm. I remember one time seen Gomek the alligator with my father back, I believe it was in the 90s. And so you would go to these places and have these neat experiences, but it wasn't all a big deal. You could do a couple of these in a day if you really were at it. And a lot of times, my family, we would get on the road, and St. Augustine wasn't just enough for us. Anastasia Island, we'd get on Anastasia Island, look around at the lighthouse, but we'd get on down to Marineland sometimes, and that was unique. Marineland actually being, it was actually I don't know if it still is, but it was a town. You would go to Marineland, and there were Marineland Studios, essentially, was how it started in the 1930s. And it was different than what you might know of SeaWorld, and you got the distinct difference, especially when you visited as a child in the 80s, because by the 1980s, there was SeaWorld, and there were all these other attractions that were more glitzy, glamour, a lot more, a lot of gift shops, and a lot of really fancy shows and stuff like that. So we would go to Marineland, and it was just, I had a good time. I enjoyed it. It was really neat. It was very, to me as a kid, it was very, I looked at it as kind of incredibly basic, and I mean this in a way of being that it was of a time when things were a little bit different. There's a difference between Disney attractions and those big ticket corporate attractions and the kinds of attractions and places people would go that I would almost say that were more to human scale, right? More to the population scale of the time, okay? I think people need to understand when you think about theme parks, you think about attractions, you think about Florida's, is the population. The population exploded in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. It had been growing throughout the 20th century, building, but it really didn't get going until the 1950s, 1960s, obviously with the advent of air conditioning, the interstate system, highways, roads. More people saw Florida, including members of my family, moved from Tennessee to Florida in the late 60s. They were part of that migration. I was born a native of Florida. And so I had unique experiences, and I was able, I think, to see the kinds of places and things that aren't around, certainly some of them not around anymore, some of them long gone. Okay, Silver Springs. Now, there was a unique experience. Went to Silver Springs a couple times, one time with my stepmother's mother, on a group with some elderly people in the early 80s, and it was really cool though. It was you get in these glass bottom boats, and you can look down as it glides through these beautiful scenic area around Ocala and Silver Springs, and that was to me the real Florida. You could just display Florida. I think the Florida that I think you hold in your heart and you believe in the nature, right? Bit by bit, year by year, okay, the nature was going. I moved eventually to Southern California. We all have our changes in life, but we always look back at, especially in our youth, what we saw, what we valued, what we treasured. And at one point, I think the state more greatly valued its natural resources. But in the early days, before the 1960s, 1970s, and I'm going to bring this up with you because it's something I came across, there were places where African Americans were allowed to vacation, where they had their own African Americans, colored people, known at the time as colored people, were designated their own vacation areas. In this case, Paradise Park for Silver Springs, a specific area for African Americans. It was great that was ended. I never really experienced that, knew any of that. But it was a fact of life until the Civil Rights era that blacks and whites vacationed in a lot of cases separately. So along came the Citrus Tower, and it at one point overlooked orange groves, and that's why it was called the Citrus Tower. And but as with a lot of things, by the 1990s, urban sprawl had surrounded the area, and the view you would have had from the Citrus Tower in, say, the 1950s was distinctly different than what you would see today. And it's still open, still doing business, and something interesting. Now, there were places like Cypress Gardens, and there are places like the Bach Tower, commissioned basically by a man named Edward Bach. It was actually dedicated by the outgoing president of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, in 1929. And I visited there with my grandmother and my father, and a very serene experience. It's one of those places, still in operation, and that's what makes it unique, is that the embrace of nature, the embrace of the idea being that you go out and you're rested. Now, and you get rest and relaxation, R&R they call it, right? Now, if you're traveling in the early days, they were building the early roads, and this was termed the longest the automobile bridge in the world, between Tampa and St. Petersburg. Ultimately, more bridges were built, they widened, we got interstates, expressways, all sorts of things, right? I remember hearing about the Sunken Gardens, seeing a brochure for it, but I never made it to see the Sunken Gardens in St. Petersburg. Never made it to Weeki or Weeki, I don't know. There was Floridaland in Sarasota. And, a fun place, and sometimes affordable vacations for people on the Miracle Strip in the western panhandle of Florida. You could go out, I think to this day you still can go out a lot of places on the coast and see places. And you know what? If you want to see the largest shell factory in the world, there you go, right? At one point, there was a place called the Snagatorium. These were unique little places. And then, of course, you had the opportunity to embrace, really get out there into nature in Key West. And you still do. And it's one thing that's very legendary. One of the last, I guess you could say one of the last places out there that may be true to its character, and St. Augustine as well. So as US 1 does, we've gotten to the end of the road, literally, and we're going to U-turn. But don't worry, we'll hurry back to Florida. What I'd like to do is talk with you in the future here on the channel about Circus World, which later on became Boardwalk in baseball, which ultimately closed. It was a unique theme park, and I visited it as a kid twice in the 1980s, as a youngster at Circus World, and then as a teenager later on at Boardwalk and baseball. So a lot of cool things that I've shared with you. I've got a lot more, and this is I'm just wetting your whistle. I'm just getting you started. I know I haven't put a lot of shows out on this channel. I'm working on getting my projects refocused, and you'll be seeing more, and I guarantee it, on here, looking at all sorts of memories I have and memories people have had in a good deal of the 20th century, okay? Looking at the United States, Florida, within the United States, Florida and California, focus on that. And I'll have more to bring you. I want to thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate those of you who've watched. There's some good shows here on the channel. There's also Exploring with George. There's also, for those of you who follow Florida history more closely, maybe you're interested in Jacksonville, I have a Jacksonville history channel called The Jack's Life. And those links I'll make available around and about. Thanks for watching. Take it easy. See you later.